Welcome to Rolling Through Negotiations, the podcast that blends the strategic mindset of BJJ athletes with insights from business owners, community leaders, and those amazing people from First Nations communities exploring how physical well-being, mental resilience, and professional development are all connected to help you negotiate the lifestyle you want to be living. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land I'm recording from today, the Kaurna peoples. Since we're online, I acknowledge all First Nations peoples across Australia and pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Check this one out, guys. This is the quote for today, inspired by our amazing guest. Before we introduce our guest, though, here's his inspired quote. "I don't have a short temper. I just have a quick reaction to bullshit." That's by Elizabeth Taylor. Our guest is the amazing Charles Pakana. Charles has got an extensive career on radio, on broadcasting, on interviewing, and he's got the amazing Vans podcast. And we connected today saying, "Hey, brother, I'd love to jump on and be a guest on your podcast. You come and be a guest on my podcast." So in this collaborative effort, we've got none other than the one and only Charles Pakana. How are you today, brother?
Well, apart from a ticklish throat, I'm doing really well. Thanks so much. And a very kind introduction, Matthew. Really appreciate it, brother. And I just want to say that I'm here on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country in Melbourne, in Naarm, and I'm blessed to be on their country and to be welcomed by their community to work here as a journalist. But it's an absolute honour to be here with you, brother.
Absolutely. And I'm really excited to be able to speak with you today, not only because of your amazing insights when it comes to journalism, comes to broadcasting, but because I think you've got some fantastic experiences in the work that you do and what you've done that our listeners are going to be able to get some insight to help them in the negotiations that they're a part of. So I'm really fired up to have this chat with you.
I'm looking forward to it.
You reached out to me a little while ago and said, "Hey, let's jump on the podcast together." And when you did, I was blushing because I've been listening to your Vans podcast, and I think it's an absolutely brilliant podcast. It's an incredible platform for storytelling, and you really do amplify First Nations voices on your podcast. What I'd love to ask you is, how do you use the Vans podcast as a way of diving into and appreciating and negotiating better outcomes for First Nations peoples and community?
I think to sum it up really briefly, it would be that the focus is always on promoting the voices of the Victorian Aboriginal people. That's really it, because let's be honest, Matthew, you and I and so many other of your listeners will be aware that one of the problems that First Nations people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have had since invasion or colonisation, whatever you want to call it, is that we've been silenced. Our voices have not been heard. And without getting political, and that's difficult for me, but bear with me, we saw that during 2023 with The Voice, a very humble ask from the Uluru State from the heart. But because we weren't being listened to, that cause failed. So I see my role as providing a platform for First Nations people to speak, to tell their stories, to tell their truths, and also for collaborators of First Nations people, reconciliation groups, reconciliation leaders, and all those who are working with us and walking alongside us, to paraphrase the last sentence of the Uluru Statement, to walk with us for a better Australia. So I see that as my primary remit with all my work.
That's awesome. And when you speak about working with us, the collaboration, and you also speak about voice, but you touched on the need for listening as well. I was just wondering, how important is it to have people listening to the voice when it is spoken?
It's absolutely critical. And look, I want to start with a positive, because what I see across Victoria, and I want your listeners to understand that I work primarily in Victoria. My business is Victorian Aboriginal news. So there's so much going on in this state, and that's what I'm passionate about. That's where I look at. But I see local governments that do nothing in the black space or that can touch in the black space without first going to their local Aboriginal advisory committees. And they listen to what's being said. They give those representatives of the local Aboriginal communities a platform to speak. And these people, the bureaucrats, the politicians, this is in local government, sit back and actively listen. And this is, as we know, such an important thing, to be an active listener, not just to hear what's being said and go, yeah, we agree, then go off and do whatever you want to do with a bit of a white saviour complex, but to listen and digest what's being said. Now, I did a recent interview at down on Gunditjmara country in the southwest of this state at Budge Bim, and we just listened to the tourism general manager there, a lovely Gunditjmara and Monaro Gunai man by the name of Joseph Saunders, talk about the Dreamtime stories behind Budge Bim, this UNESCO cultural listed site, and talking about what's seeking to be achieved there through business opportunities, through keeping mob on country and working at this site. And if people listen to it more than just a feel-good story, but understand the amazing work that's being done by Aboriginal people on their own country to heal land, to close the gaps in so many ways, then listening that way gives you the learnings that you can then carry across into your own life. And that's why it's important, because so much can be achieved just by flaming well listening.
So understanding and listening to then be able to learn and grow to achieve a better life for yourself.
Absolutely.
And those that you love. And it's interesting as well, because you spoke about, for example, working with communities, working with community organisations, some government rallying, and there's some quite traditional means of communication. And you're out there in quite an innovative platform of podcasting. How do you see the interplay between the innovation that podcasting brings with those more traditional forms of creating change?
I think it's a perfect fit, Matthew. There's no doubt about that in my mind. And pretty well everywhere I travel across Victoria and start gathering these stories, in the vast majority of cases, I am welcomed. People understand what we're seeking to achieve. Because my podcast is also broadcast on Victoria's only Aboriginal-owned radio station, 3K&D, a quick plug for them. But our mob recognises the need to utilise technology, to use new ways of communicating. We recognise that we are in a very colonial environment. We're in a very modern environment. And one of the great things about Aboriginal people, and once again, you'll know this, Matthew, Aboriginal people are very adaptable. That's why we are still here. 2.5 centuries later, after they tried to eliminate us, we're still here, we're thriving, and we're taking advantage of what we have on hand. And whether that's a Ford Transit van to travel around Victoria and live in it and share stories, it's a stack of audio recording equipment and a modern radio station to broadcast those stories, that's all part of the deal. Everybody recognises we need to use whatever tools we have at hand to share our stories, to share our successes, to share our learnings, and to share our aspirations as well.
Yeah, so the long-standing strength of resilience being used in a newer platform of podcasting, I think that's very inspiring, brother.
Absolutely.
And I was wondering, in terms of all the work that you've done and the impacts that you've achieved through your podcast and your work in community, from your perspective, have there been any surprises or meaningful ways that came about that you weren't at first expecting that you've experienced through podcasting?
Well, look, I suppose I should start with why I started along this path. And that is that around about 2018, I was asked by a radio station to come on board as the treaty correspondent. It was a full-time job, and that was to provide broadcast coverage of the treaty process that was happening here and is still happening here with great success in Victoria.
Mm-hmm.
So that was happening really well. And after a while, and I'm not going to mention names, but I had a bit of a run-in with the station manager to the point where they said to me, look, you can't travel to do your interviews anymore because we don't have the money for it. You've got to stay in the studio and do all your interviews via telephone. Now, the reality is that if I'm going to be out there interviewing my elders and members of the mob, we know full well it's a face-to-face interview that is culturally appropriate where possible, and you get a better result. So a huge row erupted from that. And after a short while, I left that radio station and started podcasting instead. Still covering the same thing, sharing it across my own online platforms. And that's just been the way ever since. But by way of surprises, well, brother, I've got to say, I didn't know what to expect. I didn't. I got rid of everything I owned. I moved into this Ford Transit van 3.5 years ago and set myself up to travel across Victoria and just podcast. So it was a very rash decision, let me tell you. It was a decision I'm really thrilled about. But I think what really surprised me was the warmth of being welcomed right across Victoria by all the mobs who were so keen to be a part of this new program, a part of sharing their stories. And I can't tell you the number of times, Matthew, where I've been out on country and I've had mobs say to me, oh, thank God a journalist has finally come out to speak to us. We just never see a journalist. And we're so grateful, at least it's an Aboriginal journalist as well. So that I think is not surprising, but it's warming. And for me, that's the most important thing.
And it sounds like part of that comes from you being there at ground level, really connecting with community rather than being a journalist in a big corporate office somewhere in the city and dialing in to a remote community. You're connecting firsthand, face to face, sharing stories and working together essentially to create a better future through the journalistic work that you're doing.
Absolutely, brother. And typically before I go out, because I'll go out for about 4 or 5 days or a week or so to any part of Victoria, and I'll always touch base with all the mob first, let them know I'm coming out and line up the interviews and the stories, and then share with them, look, I'm not going to be staying at a motel. I'm going to be sort of just living in my van. Hey, where's the best place to park? And they love the fact that I'm actually not going to be at a motel, that I'm actually going to be parked in my van up at a local reserve. And so often they say, look, Uncle Charles, come and park in my front yard, which is really lovely. But there is that connection, that realization that I am there to really listen to them, that I'm not just from a big media organisation. And that's nothing against the big media organisations, Matthew. They're simply not geared for this. I'm very fortunate that all my work, which is primarily self-funded, it's another matter in its own right, gives me the ability to set my own schedule. So if I want to go up to Mildura for a week, which is what I'm doing in a couple of weeks' time, I can do that. I'm not tied to be back in an office at any time. As a matter of fact, I don't even have an office. My office is actually on my bed in my van. That's where I do most of my work.
Yes. I think it's inspiring. It's amazing to hear the work that you do and the way that you travel through using your own van to reach out and connect with community members to bring truth and to help with the needs of community. There's a great sense of humility and also a strong sense of freedom in the way you go about the work that you do. How powerful are principles of humility and freedom if we want to achieve positive negotiation outcomes?
Oh, look, I think humility will go humility first. That's absolutely of paramount importance, Matthew. I think if anybody were to go onto another mob's country with a degree of arrogance, then no one's going to talk to you for a start, because the vast majority of people, whether they're black, white or brindle, they're going to pick up if you're an arrogant person simply seeking to promote yourself. So you've got to go in there being humble and demonstrating that you want to listen to them. And it comes back to your first question, that importance of listening. That is what I have to do as well. And when the mob realizes that you're there to listen, you're not there to be a savior, to tell them how to do things, then they accept you and they come forward with their stories. So that's absolutely critical. Essentially, it's basic 101 practice within my tiny organisation. And on the matter of freedom, well, it goes back to how I responded before. That degree of freedom is absolutely essential. The reason I'm going up to Mildura in a couple of weeks is because one of the elders is doing an art exhibition at the Koori Heritage Trust next year. And he rang me up and said, oh, look, I'm doing this exhibition. I really need to have a bit of a video done. Could you come up and do it for me? So that's a great thing to go and do for him. I can simply say, yes, I'll go and do it. And because I've got that freedom, I can at the same time, I can work out to do interviews along the way. For example, I'll be going through Tungarung country, Wodjabullock country, then up to the Mallee country. So I can organise interviews on my way. So that helps me phenomenally.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you explain the relationship between humility and freedom. And hearing you explain these meanings and sentiments, I'm feeling a closer relationship with the notions of humility and freedom that perhaps I didn't realize before. So I really appreciate this explanation, Charles.
It's unintended, but thanks, brother.
You were speaking and you mentioned about some of the work that you've done in terms of bringing about treaty that so necessarily needs to happen. And I was wondering about the sorts of negotiation principles and whether you see negotiation principles as a pathway for treaty to be achieved.
Look, absolutely. And I'll just point out, as a journalist, it would be inappropriate for me to comment on certain negotiation activities that may occur. And negotiations, by the way, have not actually started here in Victoria. We are, I believe, about to start quite soon. The First Peoples Assembly of Victoria has registered with what we call the Treaty Authority and stated that it is ready to negotiate a statewide treaty. We're just waiting for the state government to come in and say, yep, we're prepared to do that. But I've been privileged over the years in covering treaty to meet with a lot of these people who will be at the lead of negotiations. Now, first and foremost, I'll point out Gunditjmara man Ruben Berg, who's one of the co-chairs of the Assembly, and the amazing Nagara Murray, Amber woman, who's the other co-chair. Now, both these people have been freely elected by the members of the Assembly, which is our representative body to negotiate treaty. And these are some of, I believe, the brightest Victorians that you'll ever come across. They're well-versed in communicating with their own people and communicating with the broader community. They are people who are also incredibly humble, but you must never, ever mistake that humility for a lack of sharpness, because they are some of the sharpest tacks in the box, let me tell you that. I believe that with the Victorian treaty process, that what we will see is negotiations that are going to be done in a culturally appropriate way. And this is a really important thing. And this is where the Treaty Authority in Victoria comes in, because it oversees, well, some of the disputes within negotiations to make sure that they're managed in a culturally appropriate way. And that's going to be something terribly exciting, something that hasn't really been seen before, because typically when two parties come in to negotiate, they both want to win. They both go to lock horns, and there'll be aggression, there'll be anger, there'll be resentment. From what I have seen, from the people I know in the Treaty Authority, we've got 5 amazing people in the Treaty Authority, 5 amazing members, and the people at the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, they're going to make sure that everybody around that table is going to be listened to. And that's a huge thing. And that's a big thing, that everybody will have their chance to speak and everybody will be listened to. because that's the culturally appropriate way. Imagine, Matthew, that, and it may not work this way, but imagine you're in a yarning circle with a group of mob, and the only person who can speak is that person holding a yarning stick. Everybody else has to listen. And that's the important thing. And that's the way I believe and hope that treaty negotiations will occur across Victoria. And in that way, you're going to drop resentment, you're going to drop anger, and you'll get better outcomes, not just for mob, but for all of Victoria, because that's what treaty is about. Treaty is meant to benefit all of Victoria.
I wonder if we can also carry some of the learning from the devastating loss that occurred as a result of last year's voice referendum by shifting the focus from the voice into the listening that needs to occur, like you say.
This is something that we're seeking to do in Victoria now, because along with my work as a journalist, what I'm also doing is working with various organisations to run forums and events across Victoria that educate all community, not just Aboriginal community, because that's not my job, that's up to the Assembly, but the broader community about the benefits, the positive benefits of a treaty. Now, we saw in the referendum, Matthew, that so often the Yes campaign was coming at it from a negative model perspective. A voice is going to close the gap. A voice will cease or bring down the number of deaths in custody, which are still going on at a horrific and alarming rate.
Yes.
Whilst those are important things and they're legitimate, there are other points that are the positive model perspective. There is the savings to the government through removing the number of, or dropping the number of people, Aboriginal people in incarceration, through improving health services. Obviously, there are massive financial benefits. So that sort of stuff, yes, we are carrying that across at one level into Victorian treaty process. We just need to recognise we're still fighting the same fight. We just need to change the focus and change our strategy on that. We need to be positive. And there's a lot to be positive about, brother.
Absolutely. And I think that when we're positive, we've got a much stronger and more powerful place to be coming from to be able to create change.
Without a doubt.
If you have the same message being spoken, one in a negative spirit and one in the positive spirit, I believe that the positive is the message that's going to be heard. I think you're spot on there. I think that it can also be challenging sometimes, especially when you listen to certain elders out there in community, because of the pain and devastation that's occurred. I think that sometimes it can be quite challenging to maintain that positivity. So sometimes it's definitely easier said than done when we're facing the real elements of truth, but really appreciate the way that you're highlighting the need for positivity to create this change.
That's a really important point you've made there, almost by alluding to it. And that is, given that the fight is continuing, given that we have to continue presenting this information time and time again to a lot of people who won't listen, but to counter the negative media, the negative commentary that we're getting, we also have to look after our own mental health. You mentioned mental health right at the beginning of this program. And I believe that in caring for yourself, that's the only way you can carry forward and do the right thing by the greater cause. I look, a bit of a humorous thing, or this line of red, which is just above my bed, if I were to take it into focus, I'll be very frank with you, that is my library of Nintendo Switch games.
Yes.
So I may be out on the road for week after week doing interviews, but I can tell you right now, for at least 1 hour a day, I will sit down in my van and I will play a really nice game.
Awesome.
And that's an important part of my mental health regimen. I look after myself physically and mentally in order to keep on going. Hey, I'm 66 and I'm not ready to retire anytime soon. Let me tell you that.
Charles, a very important and deep question for you now. What's your favorite Nintendo Switch game?
Oh, so that would have to be, I think, really Legend of Zelda, Tears of the Kingdom, I think, which is absolutely brilliant, an open world adventure game. That I really am reluctant to say how many hours I put into that game. since it came out. Let me say it's north of 200 hours.
Nice. 200 enjoyable hours.
Absolutely.
A few years ago, Charles, we're heading towards Christmas, and I was speaking with a friend who were at the shopping center food court, and I was saying, I'm really looking forward to Christmas holidays because I can pull out my Nintendo Switch and play FIFA soccer for hours upon hours per day, because I really also love the Nintendo Switch and computer games. But what I do to try and keep my focus, I pack it up during the year and just pull it out for those Christmas holiday periods, because otherwise I'll find myself playing way too much. So it's kind of like, if you're going to be on a diet, you can walk into the candy store so long as you can be disciplined and perhaps buy one small candy. But if you're going to overindulge, perhaps don't go into the candy store at all. And I'm sort of that second type where, oh no, I'll overindulge, so don't go in the store at all, right? So I pack it away. Anyway, our friend, I was saying, but do you think there's any benefits from playing computer games, or is it a complete waste of time? And before I give you the answer my friend gave, I'd love to hear what you think, Charles. Do you think that there's benefits that playing computer games can bring to us, or is it a complete waste of time?
Look, I don't think it's a waste of time. A few years ago, I spent a couple of years, I took a bit of a break from journalism, and I spent quite a bit of time talking about mental health, because I was diagnosed quite a number of years ago as a manic depressive, never to be called bipolar. I was diagnosed as a manic depressive, and I'll hold on to that quite proudly. And I did quite a number of speaking tours. I actually went into South Australia to do a speaking tour there through Bordertown, Mount Gambier, and various other areas. And I wrote a book about my own experiences in going off medication and looking after myself, and the crap I put my family through in going off medication. But I wrote a book, and in one of those chapters, I wrote about the importance to me of video gaming, but the type of video game. So when I look at a video game, it's got to be achievable. It's got to be constructive. I don't go into the pure shoot-em-ups, those 3D first-person shooters. I never play any of those. Typically, I'm a Mario fan, even though I love Zelda, but I love playing those light-hearted games where the only people you're destroying are either totally unworldly monsters, which have nothing to do with anything on Earth, or ghosts, like in Luigi's Mansion. I think they're critical. If it weren't for video gaming for me, I would be in a lot of trouble. I'm really quite serious on that.
It's wonderful to hear that gaming has served you in such positive ways. And
can I pause for a second? I'm sorry, I've got a cough. Sorry about that, brother. Yep.
No, all good. And just while you were speaking, I was Googling as well, because you've just shared, and my friend back in this food court experience also shared, that yes, there are benefits of playing video games. And some of these benefits, coming from sources across the web, say quite clearly that computer games help us with our problem solving. They help us with our cognitive development. They help us develop the ability to analyze a whole heap of facts and data very quickly and make decisions upon that. They enable us, particularly in this online world where we can connect with people while we're playing our games. They help us to make social connections. They help us mentally. They also help us create teamwork, create communities. They even help us with our eyesight. And there's even more. So it's really interesting when you look at this, because I think that there's a bit of a negative stigma that comes particularly from parents and people saying, oh, my kid's playing too much computer games and things like this. But in moderation, like you've shared as well, Charles, there's a ton of benefits.
In moderation, absolutely. And for goodness sake, is Nintendo going to be sponsoring this episode or not, brother?
Oh, no, I better reach out to them and ask them to sponsor. But also, with all the benefits and keeping with our theme of negotiations, our video game playing also helps us with our negotiations. Because if you take decision making, for example, or the ability to analyze a whole heap of data and make quick decisions that are impactful, obviously computer games help us with this, but that's obviously a very important skill when we're negotiating as well.
I really agree with that. And the other another part of that is that I've found that it provides me with a link to younger people, because quite often I will be interviewing younger people, or I'll be hosting an event where there are young people there. And I'm always looking for some form of hook to connect with younger people. And I remember a few months ago, I was asked to speak at an event on a panel in front of about 100 school students, all year 12 students. And during a bit of a break, and it was going a little bit awkwardly right across the entire thing, during a bit of a break in the event, I said to the community, or to the audience, how many of you are Nintendo Switch players? And there was this collective, why is this old bloke asking us this question? So a few of them put their hands up, and I just said, yeah, what's your favourite game? And it was per chance, they said, it's a Zelda game. And I said, right, have you got to this point there? And all of a sudden, there was that connection that was established between me and these people, and the event just went so much better. So I found it as a great connector, a great icebreaker with so many people. And it's not just young people. I think most of us play games at one level or another.
An element of commonality.
Yeah, and you've got to find that.
If we can find the common ground, that can obviously help us in our negotiations. It can overcome a whole heap of barriers. And I've even heard of stories and explanations to do with racism, where often racism can be something that is bred into people from a very young age, and they draw from the opinions of those around them who probably are older people as they're growing up.
Yep.
And they separate themselves and people that sort of belong with their own racial demographic from other people from different racial demographics. And then that's where racism stems from, in terms of what I've heard. But I think that this principle of commonality can be such a powerful vehicle to overcome situations that are serious, like racism, where if I can imagine if a person who was racist could see the commonality between them and the people that they are being racist against, then that breach, that harsh division of racism could be eradicated through seeing the commonality that exists between us, all these humans.
I really agree with you there, and that really applies right across everything. And if you don't mind, I'll bring it back to treaty for a second. Well, and I mentioned before that everybody involved in the treaty process wants to achieve a better outcome for Victoria. And can you imagine the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria on one hand meeting with the state government to negotiate a statewide treaty, and both of them establishing up front, our goal is to create a better Victoria for all Victorians.
Yes.
And there's that commonality. And you haven't gone in at loggerheads. You've gone in there with a common goal.
Yes.
So absolutely. And I know that that's what they're pushing now. And that's one of the things I love about the treaty process here in Victoria, that regardless that they're Aboriginal people at the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria and the Treaty Authority, everyone is seeking a better outcome for all Victorians. There's that common cause and common goal. And goodness, that's fundamental to negotiation, surely.
Absolutely. And so, you amazing listeners, you amazing people that have tuned in, been a part of this conversation with Charles and I'm going to deliver you now the 3 powerful takeaway points that you can use in your very own negotiations based on what Charles has been sharing with us today. The first one of these 3 is having a voice. So Charles has been speaking about the need for truth telling, for seeking collaboration, and also having that voice and using your voice. As another example, Charles uses his Vans podcast as a way of communicating the message to negotiate the right outcomes for those and those people in which you serve. So having that voice. Number 2, principle, use this in your own negotiations. It's about understanding and listening. So if you can understand the message of others, if you can listen to the message of others, you can use this understanding to help you create a better lifestyle. You can also use the understanding and listening of another person's or another group's perspective to then be able to negotiate from the right paradigm in which they are coming from. The third takeaway point here, Charles, I'm going to categorize as being appropriate. And I feel that the biggest umbrella of these is really being culturally appropriate. But under this, you've shared some values. And the values that you've also shared with us today have been about humility, freedom, and commonality. And I feel personally in my heart, the biggest one of these values is the cultural appropriateness. And culture, there is not one single set of, hey, this is culturally appropriate, but culture and what is appropriate is a fluid concept, a fluid notion. But if we can be respectful and if we can seek to understand what the culture and what the appropriateness is about as the principle and paradigm to be coming from, if we can use our humility and be free in doing this by letting go of things as well as part of that freedom, letting go of ego, letting go of unnecessary beliefs and unnecessary things of the past to create better outcomes and seeking commonality to achieve better results in our negotiations as a third takeaway principle. Charles, it's been amazing connecting with you today. Have you got anything else you'd love to say?
No, I've got to say, I loved your summation then. That was really great because quite often I talk and I don't listen to what I say.
Yes.
But to hear you encapsulate those three key points at the end, I think is really helpful for me. And I'm glad you put in respect.
Yes.
Now, that commonality, that cultural approach is all about respect because there is no one set of cultural guidelines, even across just NAM or Melbourne, let alone Victoria or Australia.
Yes.
So, look, that's pretty well it, but I really appreciate the opportunity to yarn with you and through you to your audience, mate.
Thank you so much, Charles. Been fantastic connecting with you today. You can also check Charles out directly on his Vans podcast. He's interviewed me today, so you can listen to that one there. And it's been great collaborating with you, Charles. Without further ado, us.